gentlemen, he started as a fan, then a photographer, then a manager. Wonder how these things happen, but ended up as a wine expert. We'll talk more about all those things later on, but welcome to the program, the Supermouth himself, Dave Drason. Dave, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on, man. I'm getting ready to relive the memories of the roar of the popcorn and the smell of the crowd.
And the wild horses and fast women. But at any rate, and we hate to start off on a down note, but obviously everybody has just heard, we're just hearing the news about Bruno Sammartino. And I just mentioned before we brought you on the show that you would have some memories, because a lot of us in the Midwest, the way that we had gotten to see Bruno actually in person was when he worked for Bruiser in the war they had in Indianapolis and Detroit with the Sheik. And he was one of the only promoters, Bruiser, that Bruno worked for that 2 years that he took off from the grind of the WWF championship.
Well, before that, Bruno really did work for Big Time Wrestling and the Sheik before that. I remember meeting him first.
I forgot how old you were. Truthfully, also, there's that.
63 this year. But the first time I met Bruno, he came into Detroit to work for the Sheik, and Georgianne Orsi, who I know her as, I can't pronounce her last name, Makalopoulos or whatever,
Macropolis. But Georgie to everybody in longtime wrestling fandom.
Right. And what a sweetheart of a gal. But she flew into Detroit, and I picked her up, her and Bruno, at the airport. And, he wrestled for the Sheik on the card, and, no big deal. And I wasn't even the Sheik's photographer back then. I was just a fan. And after the show, I took them. Bruno wanted to go for Chinese food. So I took them to a little Chinese food place that was only half a mile from, Cobo Arena. And every time Bruno would come in, hence, for the Sheik after that, that's when I was the Sheik's photographer, and, good to see Bruno. And what a sight, such a nice man he was to everybody. And every time he'd come in for the Sheik, me and him would always go and have Chinese after the show. And then one time, the very last time he worked for the Sheik, Bruno said to me over dinner that, he's booked again against the Sheik in 2 weeks, and don't say anything, but I ain't coming in. And it's like, oh, geez, what's this all about? And over dinner, he had happened to explain that the Sheik shorted him on a payoff. Sheik promised him $2,000 and only gave him $800.
Oh, my God.
So he says, keep it under your hat. I'm not going to be here. And he didn't show up. And, what happened was that, they announced it to the crowd. Bruno, was stuck on, his airplane or something like that. And then Louie Martinez, comes rushing into the arena, dressed in his street clothes and a suitcase in his hand, and runs into the ring and said, hey, Bruno couldn't make it, but I heard, and he called me, and I rushed here. He ran into the ring, and him and the Sheik went an hour Broadway.
Oh, good Lord. They wanted to punish the fans even further?
Oh, no, it was a great bout. It was really good.
I don't know whether, in those days, I guess I can see Louie Martinez going an hour.
Mm-hmm.
But
right after that, it wasn't too long after that, when the Bruiser came in running opposition to the Sheik, I'd say about it, maybe a year later that Bruno ended up coming in for Bruiser and had, many great bouts with, Heenan and the Blackjacks and Baron von Raschke and, but Bruno wasn't really a big draw here. He was more, East Coast, the New York thing. And when he came in here, he really didn't have a name. So really the only fans that really knew him were the ones who collected like Wrestling Review, Wrestling, World, Wrestling Monthly, the fans that read the magazines and the fanzines from back in the day. He wasn't promoted on TV at all. He was just a name that came in, and the fans sort of just didn't get him.
Well, and I was mentioning to Brian earlier that at that point in time, it was the magazines because it was too early for videotape. And when you think about it, since then, Bruno's had more of an impact, because think how many people as we said, moved from the Northeast, Boston and New York and Philadelphia and all those places between like the 60s and the 80s. Bruno may have been more of a household name after he retired in a lot of those places than he was when he was actually in the business because of the regional territories.
Yep.
But if you were a dedicated wrestling fan, obviously you knew who he was. And it was, I've always wondered what started the ill will with Bruno and the Sheik that led to Bruno. But Bruno and Bruiser had a pretty good relationship too, I guess, didn't they? Because elsewise, Bruno wouldn't have worked for that many people.
Yeah, and like I said, the breakup of the Sheik and Bruno was the, shorting on the payoff at the one Kobo show. And, he goes to the Bruiser and, usually the, big time wrestling shows and the Bruiser shows, that would run on consecutive nights, same nights, so, Kobo was bringing in major talent from all over the NWA that, Sam Muchnick was sending in guys from like Eddie Graham and Cyclone Negro and Gorilla Monsoon, and just everybody was coming in on the Kobo shows. And I mean, they were great matches, but the same thing. The fans had no idea who these guys were.
Well,
unless you were a dedicated wrestling fan and knew them from the magazines.
With Bruiser, I think he was almost smarter the time he spent in Detroit because his cards were smaller. He had his territory stars, the Blackjacks and Heenan and Von Raschke and Ladd and Bob Ellis and Sailor Art Thomas. But the cards were smaller. Sheik was flying guys in from everywhere, having 12, 14 matches on the card. And eventually Sheik ended up with the same thing he had to begin with, Detroit. But all Bruiser did was pull back out of Detroit and go back to where he had started to begin with. It really kind of, that war burnt both territories out because they were never the same after they reconciled and Bruiser and Sheik had their matches. But either territory was never that hot again.
No, that was the beginning of the end.
Somebody tweeted the clipping here not long ago where the Kobo sold out with 12,000 and the Olympia had like 9 or 10 on the same night.
That was like one of the very first shows that they butted heads together. After that, the Sheik was drawing consistently, I'd say 9 to 12,000. Bruiser was doing 2 to 4 if he was lucky.
Yeah. And was that once or twice a month? That was twice a month in those days, right?
Twice a month, and there was weeks on end that the Sheik was running every week. Either he was running, Kobo Arena, or if he couldn't get the arena because maybe, a Stars on Ice or a concert or something like that was booked in there, he would go to the state fairgrounds, or he would go to, Kobo Hall, right next door, which was a one-level thing and not arena. So it's like, that was pretty bad. You'd get 5 to 7,000, people there, but they were all sitting on, floor seats. There was no risers or anything. So everybody sort of complained about that, but hey, they still drew and they still made money.
But that's insane. Detroit was selling several 100,000 wrestling tickets a year for all those events. And, for a period of a couple of years, they were especially hot. But at any rate, and then, of course, Sheik, the 60s run was incredible. But Bruno, I think he will go down, and we can put a period on this and return to happier thoughts. But Bruno's going to go down not only as one of the biggest box office attractions in the history of the business, but he's also one of those rare guys that didn't really have to make a move. I've always loved those guys, Lawler in Memphis or Vern Gagne in Minneapolis or Bruno in really in the Northeast. They could get over and stay over and have legendary careers without having to do the road thing for years and years and never have a home base. And in this, that was even more remarkable.
Those were the luckiest guys in the business. Yeah. But on a final note on the Bruno thing, from a few things that I've seen online and stuff already, God rest his soul and stuff like that, but I hated already that the WWE is putting things out there like they made him and, Vince McMahon Sr. was, the saving. He made Bruno Sammartino, but there is no mention in there about Vince McMahon Sr. when he blackballed Bruno back in the early 60s.
Yeah, and actually, and Bruno talked about that on the Straight Shooting Series interview that I did with him. We were talking about earlier in the program, because basically he got heat somehow, and had to go to Toronto and work for Frank Tunney, where he was over, especially with the Italian audience there, but as the young Italian strongman, and he was doing such great business in Toronto that finally Vince Sr. had to break down and bring him back when he needed a guy for the Garden. Yep. And that was kind of sweet. And after that, they worked together, but it was always a little more strained in business after that.
Oh, yes.
But hey, speaking of strain in the wrestling business, you were telling me, we were talking on the phone a couple of days ago, you had a run-in one time in your early managing days with an old veteran manager that I had a run-in one time with, and tickled the shit out of both of us.
You're not talking about the general, are you?
The general, the field marshal, Homer Odell. Would you tell the folks your experiences with General Homer Odell?
Well, it's my first experience was with him this was my very first year managing in the business, and I'm trying to get over, and I was like George Cannon's top manager at the time, and this was Superstars of Wrestling out of Windsor, right? Right, Superstars of Wrestling, but they were also working with the rival promotion, another one that Killer Brooks, Tony Marino, Ben Justice, Jack Kane, when they left the Sheik in late 1974 through 1975, and George Cannon worked together. Yeah. So anyway, I'm like the only manager, and I'm learning, things, and this one day we're going up to London, Ontario, and we happened to meet a couple of the boys. First, it was Frenchie Martin, who was driving, Blackjack Luca, who I was managing, and we met in Windsor. And there was this other guy who happens to come in, and it's like, oh my God, it's like, is this the guy who I seen pictures of and, in the magazines and stuff? And it's sure enough, it's General Homer Odell. Gets in the car, and I'm like, my God, he's dressed up in like a Nazi outfit, black leather, black this, black coat, black long coat. He's got the steel, helmet on and everything with the Iron Cross on top of it. Oh, right? Oh yeah. And thank God I didn't have to go through the border crossing with him like that. He was already in Windsor, so I didn't have to deal with that. And I don't know how he got across, but that here nor there. So anyway, we're driving to London, Ontario, and it's like a little over 2-hour ride. And early in the conversation, he starts talking weird stuff and all. And at one point, he's got these boots, black leather boots that go up to his knee, and he pulls out this like 12 to 14-inch Luger gun. And I'm like an 18-year-old kid, and I was like, what the, I was scared to death. So anyway, now, not only scared to death of that, now I'm thinking, now they're bringing another manager in, and here I'm first starting, and I'm thinking I'm going to get replaced. But anyway, so I'm watching in the hallway. I was managing, I think, Killer Brooks that night, who was in the main event. And General Homer Odell, I forgot who he was managing. So I'm going to watch him work. So I'm standing in the hallway, and he goes out there. They do the ring introductions, and he gets out, for the ring. The match starts, and Homer Odell grabs a chair, ringside chair, and sits in the corner. And I watch him, and he leans his head up against the ring post. And that's the way he sat the whole match. He fell asleep. So, and the only way he woke up, he had nothing to do with the whole match, like giving instructions or, yelling at the referee. He slept the whole match. And the only way he woke up is when the bell rang, when the match was over. He wakes up, jumps in the ring, raises his guy hand, and, he's the hero and walks out. And it's like, and that was the only time I ever saw him again. Well,
Homer Odell is a mythic figure in wrestling for the people that listen to the podcast, the younger generation who are like, who the fuck are they talking about? It's got to be on YouTube. There's a clip when General Homer Odell from Memphis TV in 1977, he was managing Brute Bernard and the Angel, who was Frank Morrell.
Okay.
And they did a deal with Armand Hussein and Plowboy Frazier, who were the baby faces. And I think Dundee may have been involved there too. But it's out there on YouTube because it's one of the old Memphis tapes that I borrowed from Lawler and saved and retained. But they're leading up to some type of paint. I think the heels had painted a yellow stripe down Armand Hussein's back, or they did it on they bring out the bucket of yellow paint. They paint a yellow streak down Armand Hussein's back, show that he's a coward. But then here comes Frazier and the rest of the baby faces, and they make a comeback, and they get this bucket of paint, and they pour the bucket of yellow paint. And I think this was an audible called on the fly because it didn't look like he really was expecting it. Over the top of General Homer Odell's head, and he is covered in yellow paint. And now he's out there by the desk, and Lance is cackling, but there's Brute Bernard and the Angel doing their shit, weebling and wobbling and everything, and acting crazy. And Odell's cutting the promo, and he's screaming, "This ain't no way to treat a field marshal." And Lance is trying to duck because every time he says anything or moves, a yellow paint's flying off of him. And Lance has that Baxter suit on. He don't want to get stained. And Lance says, "Well, come on, Homer, you're going to get paint on me. Shut up before I kiss you." And he, depending on what he had drunk or not drunk or took or not took, he could either be an insane person or, like you said, asleep. They told me the story in Charlotte that he was arrested one time. I guess in the 60s, he was managing Bronco Lubitsch and Aldo Bogny over there as a tag team, and the cops arrested him for shooting at submarines in a lake.
Oh,
he was convinced that the subs were coming in and landing, and he had to be the one to defend the North Carolina coast, but it was a lake. But when I went to Atlanta in the summer of '83, when they sent us down from Tennessee to work for Ole and run the little Georgia towns, right? Homer Odell had been down on his luck because this is 10 years after practically what you're talking about. He hadn't been anywhere in the business in a while. And he'd gone to Ole Anderson in Georgia because he was big in Georgia in his day. And he asked Ole for a job, and Ole said, "Hold on. We're going to have a separate crew running the local towns. You can be the manager." Well, then he didn't think anything more of it. Well, old Homer goes and gets a room at the Falcons Rest Hotel down there on Virginia Avenue in Hapeville, next to the airport, where all the wrestlers stayed, where we were going to stay. And Dundee's the booker. He don't know anything about Homer Odell. Well, goddamn. I see the first day that we get there, that we do promos at Atlanta TV, Homer Odell came to talk to Ole Anderson. And that's when they told him that he didn't really have a spot. And then Dundee and the rest of the guys come back and say, "You need to watch out for Homer Odell because you took his job. He's fucking hot." Now, I know, okay, the guy that was shooting at fucking submarines in a lake in Charlotte that lives in the same apartment complex as me is now mad at me, and I've just been into business for fucking 6 months. Mm-hmm. So I'm shaking like a dog shitting peach seeds. And for 2 weeks, I don't go out alone in the hallway of the Falcons Rest, which looked like the Bates Motel, right? I don't go out alone at night. I take my garbage out in the middle of the day. I go out to meet the guys in the parking lot and go for my rides. I know which apartment. And Homer has also recently been in trouble at the Falcons Rest because his cooking set the room on fire. He had a fire and it burned up a lot of his Nazi memorabilia he had hanging all over the walls. When the firemen broke in, it looked like goddamn Hitler's bunker, right? Mm-hmm. So anyway, finally, one day we're going to go to Augusta. And I'm going to ride with Dundee and Frank Morrell and another one of the boys, Ronnie West, I think. And the other guys are going to follow us. And one of the guys had just left my apartment and closed the door behind him. And I turn around to get my bag, and there's a knock at the door. And I think it's this guy, he's left something. And I open the door, and I'm face to face with Homer Odell. He's got no shirt on. He's wearing shorts and flip-flops. And he's got a knife in his hand. I shit myself. I'm telling you, I've nearly smothered myself in shit. And you know what he said to me? He said, "You got any tomatoes?" He was cooking again. He wasn't supposed to, but he was cooking again. And he needed some tomatoes that's what I smelled all down the hallway every time I went out in the hall was Homer's stew. which boy. I don't know what he was putting in it, but it could have been roadkill. But he was a different kind of cat.
He was a different cat and a legend in the business. If I can, interject real quick, like on things that scared us, the one thing that came to mind was in 1967, there was a fan convention here in Detroit run by Dawn Porter and, and she was in with a lot of the guys. So a lot of the, boys from big time wrestling.
Watch the way you say that now.
Yeah. So this was pre-WFIA days. So anyway, after the convention and the Kobo show, Dawn Porter had a party in her suite at the Sheraton Cadillac Hotel. And somehow I get invited to this thing. And I'm 13 years old. And I've got my camera. And, I'm there, and like Bulldog Brower is there, and Lord Layton is there, Al Costello, Bobby Shane. And, they were nice. I was a kid, but they were kayfabing me and stuff. But in walks Don Fargo to this party. And everybody is like, oh boy, Fargo's here. Oh, geez. So anyway, Fargo, in the middle of this party, and, remember, I'm a 13-year-old kid. He goes up to like the bureau or a desk, drops his drawers, pulls out his Vince Russo, puts it on the desk, and he's got a hammer and a nail. And he puts this nail right through the head of his pecker. And I'm like stunned in belief. And the women are like going nuts, and Lord Layton's trying, he's trying to make peace and everything, and Don Fargo's standing there naked as a jaybird with this nail through the head of his pecker and standing on a desk and his arms out in all his glory. And it's like, oh my God.
Where else
I gotta be in this business.
Well, you've spent some time around some interesting. Were you even in the business yet when you were driving Andre around the first time he came through Detroit, or were you still a photographer?
I was the Sheik's photographer then. I was the Sheik's photographer, and I was writing the body press program here.
How did they break the news to you that you were going to be driving around this 7'4" giant that everybody was going gobsmacked for the first time?
Well, the very first time, I met him, he, was at the Kobo show. He worked the Kobo show, and he needed a ride back to his hotel. And it's like he didn't stay at the Sheraton Cadillac, where most of the boys stayed. He stayed at the American Hotel. I guess he got a weekly rate or something like that, because when he first came here, he was here for 3 weeks. Andre, he moved from territory to territory back in those days. So it's like I drove him back to his hotel, and then he goes, "Hey, boss, Toronto, tomorrow." Like I wasn't planning on going to Toronto, for the show, but, I had a big Ford LTD at the time, so he fit in there comfortably. And it's like, well, okay, the next day I drove him up to Toronto. We did the Toronto show. And then the next day we had Lima, Ohio. And then the next day, so for the, 3 weeks straight, I drove Andre, all over the territory. And it was another one of those eye-opening experiences for a young kid.
Did you get to experience the famous giant fart that has been talked about and made legend?
No, never got to do that. He was a gentleman in front of me.
He must have liked you.
He did. A couple of stories on, Andre anyway. We're in Dayton, Ohio one night. And after the show in Ohio, they really didn't have too many, say, party stores open at night. So what you could do in Ohio was go to a bar, and I mean, you could drink there and stuff, but you can also buy beer to take out. So, Andre, wants some beer. So we drove a little ways away from the arena so we wouldn't be near any of the fans, and we stopped, saw a bar, and Andre gets a case of beer. So, okay, he's got his case of beer. We get back in the car, and it's like, now we've got, 3.5 to 4 hour drive back to Detroit. So from, Dayton, Ohio, we hit Toledo, which is a little over 2 hours. Andre's out of beer. And it's like 2 a.m. And he says, "Hey, boss, I need beer." I go, "Andre, it's like 2 a.m. Where are we going to get beer now? There's nothing up." "Boss, I need beer." It's like, oh my, what am I going to do? I can't pull off. There ain't nowhere. And as soon as he said it again, "I need more beer," here comes a Stroh's beer truck, which was a famous beer here in Detroit. And it pulls alongside of us. Andre got all excited. He opens up the passenger side of my car door, and he's waving his arm for this driver to pull over so he can get some beer. Well, the driver didn't stop. He didn't get no beer. And for the next hour and a half, Andre wasn't a happy camper until he got back to Detroit.
If it had been 10 years later, he would have recognized Andre and he would have stopped. But as it was, he thought there's a giant demon human waving at me out of that Ford LTD. I'm not pulling over.
Well, here's one. When he came back to the territory again, I'd say maybe a year later, same thing. Boss Dave had to drive Andre around, and I didn't have no problem with that. We had fun together. And it's like after a Kobo show, we had to go up to Toronto the next day to work the show for the Tunnies. So Andre hadn't been to, hadn't really done the sightseeing thing in Toronto before. So he asked me if we can go up early and if I can show him and drive him around the city of Toronto and show him, what it's like. I said, sure. So we left Detroit early, like about 6 a.m, and we got up there about 9:30, 10 o'clock. So we checked into the Chelsea Hotel, which was a few blocks from Maple Leaf Gardens, and we walked down to Yonge Street. And the thing in Canada back in those days is that if your establishment was open on Saturday, you couldn't be open on Sunday. Or if you were open on Sunday, you couldn't be open on Saturday. That was their law back then. But restaurants were a different, they were exempt from that.
Because people got to eat every day.
Yeah. So me and Andre, we're going to go for breakfast. So we walk into this little diner. I mean, there's no regular seating. There's only seats at a counter. I'd say like 10 seats at a counter, the little stools, the little round stool things. So we walk in there, and me and Andre, we're the only two in there. So we sit at the, at the counter, and it's a Chinese couple that own the place. And their eyes got as big as, saucers seeing, Andre, like everybody else did. So anyway, this little lady in broken Chinese and broken English comes over to take our order. So I order up, the usual bacon, eggs, stuff like that. So Andre, in his voice, he looks at the little lady and he says, "I want half done egg. I want 1 pound bacon. I want half loaf toast." And this lady looked at him like he was an alien. She didn't understand a word he was saying. So anyway, I said, "Andre, tell her again." So he goes, "I want half dozen eggs. I want 1 pound bacon. I want half loaf toast." She nods, goes in the back. And you can see her husband in the back, through the see-through, wall there where he's cooking. So like 10 minutes later, here comes our food. She plops down mine, my bacon, eggs, toast, everything in front of me. Everything's fancy. Sets down Andre's plate in front of him, and he looked at me. I looked at him. We looked at his plate. We looked at her, and we started belly laughing uncontrollably. And we just couldn't stop laughing. And we looked at it again, and this lady's standing there. She's wondering, what the heck are these two laughing about? Well, Andre's plate, which she put down in front of him, was a half an egg, a little bit of egg, 1 piece of bacon, and a half a slice of toast on this plate. So it's like, we looked at that, and she, so I'm, trying to explain to this lady. I says, no. he wants a half dozen eggs, and I hold up 6 fingers. He wants 6 eggs, and he wants a pound of bacon, and I'm making like a gesture like a mound of bacon. And I says he wants a half a loaf of toast, so I'm put my hands out like the bread loaf and like half of that. She looked at me, she looked at him and says, "You gonna eat that?" And we laughed so hard again we couldn't stop. And it's like, he got his food, and it was like one of the funniest experiences of breakfast I've ever had.
It would seem more plausible that Andre would eat what he ordered than would eat what she brought him when you would look at it. But maybe she was verklempt is what she was.
Oh, I wish I had my camera just to take a picture of that plate. It was just too hilarious.
What you were telling me earlier also when we talked that I think you're going to be the first person that's ever been on the Jim Cornette Experience that has both managed the Sheik and met Gentleman Bobby Davis, the first great manager. And how did either one of those or both take place?
Well, let me do the Bobby Davis one first. When Dick the Bruiser, had his rival promotion, the very first show was at the Olympia Stadium. And Bobby Heenan and, Blackjack Lanza were such good friends of mine. It's like, oh, God, they're there. And, I'd really like to see them. They're in town, but I had to be at Cobo Arena, because I was, Sheik's photographer. Well, Sheik and Les Ruffin, they go, hey, skip pictures tonight. You go there, take pictures there. Because I can probably, get in easily, just ask Bobby or something like that. And, myself and Les Ruffin ended up going there
and
to that show.
And
basically for me, I could take, pictures, but I was also like the unknown spy, So anyway, I'm back by the dressing room, and this gentleman comes out of the dressing room, and it's like, I know this man. I know him from somewhere. So I happened, got up the nerve to say, excuse me, I know you, but I can't, know who you were, and I just can't picture the name. And he puts his hand out and he introduces himself as I'm Bobby Davis. I go, Bobby, yes, manager from, Buddy Rogers and, those
the
guys. The
Graham brothers and all those guys. Yeah.
And we had like a nice 10-minute conversation, and, he was a very nice guy,
Do you remember who he had come to visit? Who was he close to there, or just see the show?
I don't know if he come to see the show, because I think he lived in Cincinnati or somewhere in Lower Ohio.
Columbus, because he got in on the ground floor of the Wendy's franchises out of Columbus and made what I understand was a pretty penny in burgers. Imagine that, a manager making money in burgers instead of spending money on burgers. Drat, I've got it backwards. But I wondered if it was because he never appeared around wrestling or, came back to the business after late 50s, early 60s. I'm wondering if he was just visiting an old friend there that day.
I'm sure he was probably visiting Bruiser. Mainly. I don't know if he knew Bobby Heenan or not. I'm sure he didn't know too many of the other guys, like Paul Christie and Sailor Thomas.
Well, I know he didn't know Bobby because that's what Bobby was surprised when he found out that his first name was Bobby. When they told him his name was Bobby at the office, because the only manager that Bruiser knew was Bobby Davis. So there you go. Yeah. That's that part of the Midwest at that time. There were so many wrestling legends still around in those days. I envy you because you got to meet some and also to manage the Sheik. When you think about that's a rare occurrence also, because he, besides for somebody he was married to as a slave girl, basically he only went through on a big name basis, Abdullah Farouk and Eddie Creechman. And then you slipped in there after the Creechman dynasty folded, did you not?
I did. I'm sort of like the manager that kills careers in a way. It's like I managed the kangaroos at the end of their career. Ben Justice. He was the first guy I ever managed, and soon after he was involved with us in the rival promotion, he left the business completely and never to be seen again. What really happened to build up to that is like when I was a photographer, here in my hometown, I was just a regular fan, and I wasn't, the Sheik's photographer back then. But, through Don Wilson and the WFIA, I got to meet Sam Muchnick, he was the very first promoter that let me shoot ringside. And that's at a time when nobody, was at ringside shooting photographs in St. Louis. But anytime I came there, Sam and Larry Matisick, always, carte blanche for me. And, I always appreciated that. And then Les Ruffin, who promoted Cincinnati then for big-time wrestling and stuff, he happened to, hear from Sam Muchnick and mention my name. And he says, yeah, I know Dave. He says he's a good kid and stuff like that. So Les Ruffin allowed me to shoot photographs ringside in Cincinnati and Dayton, Ohio, which were Sheik towns. So now it's the Sheik sees me shooting ringside, and it's like, I didn't know what his reaction would be, and I just didn't know. And then in 1971, 1970, when they had one of the very big first super shows at Cobo Arena, it's like, oh my God, I gotta shoot ringside for this, because I was taking pictures for Wrestling Review and Ring Wrestling then. And I went, Frankie Diamond, who was one of the Sheik's gophers back then, put up the ring and did whatever. I happened to talk to him, and he introduced me to Joyce, and Joyce Farhat said, "Yeah, just go ahead." They let the guards know and stuff, and from that day on, I was taking photographs ringside at Cobo Arena, and then every week, I'd bring my photographs to Joyce. She'd see them. Eddie Farhat Jr. would look at them. They liked what they saw, asked if they can use them for the body press, and one thing, led to another, and I got paid, for my photographs. And then it, became Frankie Diamond. Bob Finnegan also would write some of the stories for the body press. And, they happened to find out that I was, a writer for the wrestling magazines. And they says, hey, if you would like to do some writing, why don't you write some of the body press here? So I started, supplying, articles for the body press. And then after a while, I started writing, the bulk of the stories that appeared there. So between the photographs and, writing, I was in the Sheik circle back then. So it became a time the Sheik knew that I wanted to be a manager. I wanted to be a Farouk. I wanted to be a Heenan. I wanted to be one of those guys. I was too small to be a wrestler, but, I thought I could talk and, do what my heroes did.
You've always been shy, Dave. You've always been a shy, retiring type. I don't really know.
Thank you for noticing, sir. But at one point, the Sheik, really took me serious. And when we would go up to Williamston at the office up there to shoot promos, for all the towns across the territory, at the very end, the Sheik would take one of the boys and take me and said, okay, you're, managing him. This is the scenario. This is who you're going against. 2 minutes, go. And I would do practice promos all the time, in front of a camera, and they'd tape it. And then me and the Sheik would go in the TV truck and view, and he would tell me, okay, this is what you're doing right. This is what you're doing wrong. You got to look the camera in the eye because you have to look the people in the eye. Those are the ones you're trying to sell to bring to the arena to put in the seats. So he would teach me these things. And then finally, he gave me the opportunity to manage. And I managed Ben Justice, here in 1974.
You retired him.
Yeah. No, but what happened was that, the Sheik knew that everybody around the territory knew me as the photographer and stuff. So he put me under a hood, which didn't, fool too many people. But, I got my start in the business that way.
What was your name?
The Scholar.
I love it.
I didn't. I was a 18-year-old kid who didn't know shit from Shinola, and I'm a scholar.
But see, here's the thing: you were even better than George Steele because he was only the student.
Yep. So anyway, that was my start here. And then after, a couple months, it's like I wasn't getting another opportunity to manage. Sheik wanted me more for my photography and writing because that's right when he was doing the program with the Bruiser. So I did that for a bit, and then, the rival promotion of Brooks Marino and, those guys came, and they gave me an opportunity, and George Cannon, and I ended up leaving Big Time Wrestling. And it wasn't until maybe 4 years later I was managing the Kangaroos and Malcolm Monroe Sr., and the Sheik was on the card. And it's like, oh, boy, this could be a little weird, only because the last time I saw the Sheik, we were in the TV truck together, and this was when I was working for a local TV station here writing TV commercials. And I used the Sheik's TV truck to film these. And the night before, I worked in Toronto against the Tunnies, for our rival promotion. So I show up the next day to film these commercials, and the Sheik comes in. And he says, I want to speak to you. And he, talks to me, and he asks me about, okay, you're with these guys now? And I explained to him, it's like, Sheik, I want to be a manager, and, I'm just not getting the opportunity. They gave me an opportunity. He says, okay, I can respect that, but from now on, if I ever see you, I'm going to break your legs. And it scared the living hell out of me. I upset the Sheik, and it upset me in a way. So now, like 4 years later, here I am going to see him in a dressing room on the same show that I'm on. So we see each other, we shake hands and stuff, and, he says, hey, I've been hearing good things about you and what you've been doing. It's like, yeah, okay, thanks, Papa. And he goes, how would you like to manage me tonight? And it's like, yo. My God, it's just like the golden ticket, from, the chocolate factory, or, I just won the lottery, and it was the greatest thrill of my life. And then for like the next year and a half, 2 years, and he was mostly in Japan back then. But when he would come home, he would do the local shows, and we'd do shows in Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario, and I always went out with him, and it was the thrill of my life to be, managing the Sheik, And the thing I always say is, like, managing, guys like Killer Brooks and Justice and the Kangaroos and Mickey Doyle and Al Snow, it was always fun. Because I can go out there, rile the crowd, mess with the referee, take a bunch of big bumps and stuff, and I can have fun. But when you're managing the Sheik, it was fun, but it wasn't that kind of fun. It was business.
Yeah.
You didn't want to make him look bad. You had to do everything perfect. You had to time, your spots, because you don't want to take away from the match. You had to do everything, that I watched over the years, what Farouk did, what Creechman did, pick my spots, do them when they're needed, pull the trunks, do the referee.
Also you had to keep an eye on the fans in a Sheik match, because chances are he might get somebody riled up.
Oh, all the time. I always said that was the 2 longest walks of my career. The first to the ring and back to the dressing room. And, there's times, and luckily for us, we had private bodyguards, Dennis and Kenny, who were guards at Cobo Arena. They were ushers. But, for smaller shows, they would always come out and be our private bodyguards. So usually, didn't have too much problem. They always, watched my back at ringside and stuff. But, occasionally, you'd get the one fan who'd get all riled up and make a run at you, and they'd get you. You get punched and kicked and spit on, and cokes and beers and coins, and that's just the nature of our business back then. And same thing, that people don't realize now. They see, the managers or valets, whatever crap that's on TV these days. We had to, almost fight for our lives, sometimes. And when you pulled into an arena, you wanted to get there early so the fans didn't see your car.
Yeah, and sneak in.
You may not have a car when the show was over.
Did you ever see the Sheik get a hold of anybody?
Yes, a couple times. Fan wise, not what people say, the blades on his fingers, which he did, but I didn't see him zip any fans or anything. But the one time I saw, well, two times. I'll tell two stories here. The first one time was we were up at a show in Port Huron, Michigan, and at the end, Sheik was going against, of all things today, Bruno Sammartino Jr. or David Sammartino.
Yeah.
So, we doing the thing, and we had the finish and stuff. And what ended up happening was it's a melee. We get disqualified. She goes, outside the ring. Sammartino catches me in the ring, and I take a bunch of bumps. Boom, boom, boom. Pop the crowd. But then what he did was, to finish, he was supposed to throw me outside the ring where the Sheik was. That way we can, be together, get back to the dressing room safely. Well, what he ended up doing, he threw me into the ropes, and then he hip tossed me over the top rope and really literally threw me onto a table, thinking that the table's going to break. Well, back then I only weighed 150 pounds. I don't think that's going to break the table, and it didn't. It more broke me. I was really messed up. And we get back to the dressing room, and the Sheik, locks the door, kicks all the boys out. It's me, him, and David Sammartino. And he goes up to Sammartino and says, you like taking liberties with my manager here, eh? And I mean, he just literally one wall to the other, just slapping him around, kicking him at everything. Just, you ain't, and I mean, cussing and swearing the whole time, and the other words, but I'll keep those words to myself. But he beat the living shit out of David Sammartino.
Oh my God! And you don't have to worry about language here, Dave. But we know you are a Christian athlete.
Well, I thought you said Brian Last is in the seminary practicing to be a priest.
No, I said Brian Last was practicing insemination.
Oh, there you go. My mistake.
Yeah, slightly different.
No, but the only other time I saw the Sheik take liberties with somebody was with Louie Martinez. This is a little bit of a story. I'll try to go a little bit faster with it. But Louie Martinez.
Well, you can't go too much slower with it, Dave. So that's.
But Louie didn't drive. So a lot of times, to shots, he would be hitchhiking or something like that, unbeknownst to, a lot of us, if he couldn't get a ride. So anyway, Dayton, Ohio, Sheik against Louie Martinez. And, the rule back then was you always arrived an hour before the show, no matter where you were on in the show.
Right.
So it's like 7 o'clock, no Louie Martinez. 8 o'clock, no Louie Martinez. Gets about 9:30 when, almost the Sheik's supposed to go on, no Louie Martinez. Well, finally he walks in. He walks into the dressing room, and now the Sheik's giving him hell about, it's like, God damn it. And Louie's like, okay, get dressed, we got to go. So Sheik goes, and he's talking over some other stuff with Mike Lauren and, Les Ruffin and stuff. And I'm sitting there with Louie, and Louie goes, oh, man. Oh, no, Louie. He was drinking. He's drinking Wiedemann beers. So it's like, oh. So anyway, it's like, oh, Louie, God dang it. Okay, let's just get through this, and, you could drive home with me tonight. Okay. So we go out, and, first we're talking over the finish, boom, boom, boom. And Louie says to Sheik, before we go out, he says, boss, no bumps, please. I'm sick. I got a little bit of flu and stuff. So Sheik, oh, okay, I'll take care of you. So anyway, we go out, and, the introductions and all that kind of stuff, and the Sheik's causing havoc, and, we waste like 5 minutes before the bell even rings. So they, start the match, and it goes for a little bit. And then at one point, the Sheik throws Louie outside the ring, which what should happen, is Louie, does, his thing where he crawls underneath the ring, comes out the other side, surprises the guy, the other, boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
So anyway, Sheik throws Louie outside the ring, and, we're waiting, and it's like I go over, and Louie's laying on the floor. And it's like, Jesus Christ. So it's like, I'm, sneaking up on him and, trying to get a little heat, maybe give him a little kick or something. And I kicked him, and he didn't move. And it's like, what the hell? And I'm looking, it's like, oh, Jesus Christ, he fell asleep. He's sleeping on the goddamn arena floor. So now it's like, I take a look at the crowd, and they're like, yeah, no, don't, and I'm going to kick him again. And I kicked him good. And he, woke up and is like, oh, ooh. So he gets back in the ring, and they toss him back and forth again. Sheik throws Louie outside the ring again. And now, I see it. Louie goes underneath the ring. So I'm thinking, okay, I go to the other side, and I'm, jazzing with the referee, and, Sheik's got his back turned. We're waiting for Louie, to come up the other side and make the sneak attack. Well, we're waiting, no Louie. No Louie. What the hell? So Sheik goes, he comes over and I'm like, I don't know. Where the hell is he? So I go over to the other side of the ring, and I look. He's curled up like a baby underneath the ring. And it's like, oh, Jesus, now what do we do? So anyway, I got to do something. So I go back and I tell Sheik, he's sleeping under the ring.
He's sleeping
he's
under
what? Sheik jumped outside the ring, goes underneath, and then it's like they both come out, the other side of the ring like a half a minute later, and they're duking it out on the floor, and then they get back in the ring. Now the Sheik, you could tell he's really pissed. And it's like, I know now it's time to go home. So what happens was, they're fighting back and forth. And then Louie Martinez does one of his famous moves, was the Indian Deathlock. So what that is like the Sheik sitting, in the ring, shoulders up, and Louie, puts his legs over your shoulders, grabs your arms, and, so that's what he does.
Yeah.
So he grabs the Sheik, straddles him, grabs his arms, and he goes, Arriba! And when he does that, the crowd's popping, and now I'm watching the back of Louie's trunks.
Oh, no.
They're starting to puff up like a blowerfish. And it's like, boom, boom. It's like, holy crap. And it's like, I go in, break it up.
Oh, very
I go in, break it up. And then it's like, now it's like the finish is all messed up. So the Sheik picks up Louie and body slams him. Boom. Louie goes down, and he's shaking. And the people think, well, it's like he's selling it. And I could tell Louie ain't selling it. Sheik picks him up again. Boom! Louie goes down. And I could see him, like, oh. Louie gets up, has the Sheik again, puts him in another Indian Deathlock, goes Arriba, and Louie's pants, I swear to God, his trunks blew up like a puffer fish, and then all of a sudden, like that. Louie shit all over the Sheik's back. They break it up, and the referee is like, oh my God, and oh Jesus. Sheik comes over to me, jumps out of the ring, he says, stall. So it's like, I'm stalling with the referee, taunting Louie. Sheik goes back to the dressing room and apparently goes in the shower, showers off, comes right back out in his gear, and he starts beating the hell out of Louie, and they fight all the way back to the dressing room, both disqualified, counted out. Same thing. She kicks everybody out of the dressing room, even me. Him and Louie were in there, and man, you could just hear it through the door. He beat the living hell out of Louie. And on the way home, Louie was like a little worse for wear, and it's like he didn't want no beers or nothing on the way home, and that's the story of Louie Martinez shitting on the Sheik.
All right. Well, Ladies and gentlemen, only here on the Jim Cornette Experience can you hear stories of wrestlers shitting on each other in front of paying customers. And I know it's going to be hard to believe, but there's somebody that may be even crazier than the Sheik. I promised Brian last, we're going to have to go. But before we go, we got to have a Chris Colt story. Our hero here on the program, both mine and Brian's, the madman Chris Colt.
I wouldn't say hero.
Well, he's one of our fascinating. We are fascinatingly interested in him. Let's put it that way.
Well, he was great. I mean, when him and Ronnie Dupree were the Hells Angels here, I thought they were the greatest. I was a young kid, got to meet him, and he was really nice to me and stuff, knew me by name, and every time he'd see me, just be nice and stuff. And then, just a great, heel guy. And I always say Chris Colt, the most underrated, underappreciated talent in the history of professional wrestling. That guy could do it all. And then he, transformed into the Chris Colt character here. And it's like I'd see him, and this was when I was a photographer and stuff. So we'd always talk about, here and his other exploits. And, our mutual friend, Tom Burke, we'd always talk about Tom. And then when I started managing for George Cannon's Superstars of Wrestling, he brought Chris up in Montreal. And George thought this would be perfect because with Chris's, rock star thing, and I had, these wild, outfits, long hair, and the rock and roll music and stuff like that, he thought we would be perfect together. And then I get up to Toronto or Montreal, and I was so excited to be able to manage him. And then just before we're ready to go on, Chris tells George, I don't want no manager. I want to do everything myself. And it's like, in front of me too.
Yeah.
It's like, oh God dang, here's my chance to be with one of my, heroes and stuff. And it's like, God dang it. So anyway, after that, we saw each other a few times. He'd roll through Detroit and we'd get together. And he was, I shouldn't say traveling with, or he hooked up with this gal who was a trainee who I helped bring in from Louisiana to work at Lou Klein's gym. Her name was Bonnie Subotnick. Really nice
Bonnie
gal.
Subotnick? Bonnie Subotnick that I'm thinking about? No, I'm kidding.
It could be Jungle Jane.
Well, that may be a different one.
Yeah. She trained at Louis Klein's gym. And he made her this Jungle Jane character, and oh my God, she was a Klein worker, and was like, nice gal, got taken advantage of here, and didn't make any money, and she tied up with Chris Colt, and I guess they ended up going to Portland and the Northwest Territory together, and and we all know Chris's likefulness for boys and young boys and stuff, which is probably well known these days. But Bonnie was his beard, and he kept on going. He was a great talent, and
she would have made more money if she'd used that gimmick, bearded Bonnie Slobotnik. that would have been. She would have ruled wrestling along with the fabulous Moolah.
Oh, it was always funny because I knew both of these gals, and to see like her and Heather Feather go against each other was, oh my God, was just mind-boggling and a photographer's treat.
Heather Feather is a favorite here on the program also, or as Paul Morton used to call her, Heavy Feather. and the indomitable Linda Klein, Lou's daughter, was a famous
Lou's daughter.
Wrestler.
He even take booking fees from his own daughter.
That's hard. That's hard.
Yeah.
Well, Moolah did too. So Moolah and Lou Klein, they came up in the same generation.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God! Is it any wonder why that we have to keep these stories alive before they're gone? Because nobody would believe that these human beings were actually real, but they were.
Oh, and, Dr. Jerry!
Dr. Jerry?
Wait! No, everybody in the wrestling business, would always say you were never in the wrestling business unless you got a Dr. Jerry Graham story.
Did you get a Dr. Jerry Graham story?
I got so many Dr. Jerry Graham stories that ain't funny. I'll have to come on another podcast with you because that can take
okay. Well, there you go. Then that's what you've just done is you've gone into business for yourself and shot your own angle, and now we got to bring you back for a return so we get the Dr. Jerry Graham stories.
Oh, God, I can give you the Dr. Jerry Graham stories, the Kabuki stories, the Leaping Larry Shane stories, Eric the Red, Heart for Love. I was just so blessed in this business to be around these guys in the golden days of, the greatest era of wrestling.